Okay, so today we're really diving into some pretty heavy stuff. We're going all the way to Sri Lanka.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's about these sanctions the UK just slapped on 4 Sri Lankan individuals. Big news.
Sanctions, huh? Yeah, those are always a big deal. So what's the story?
Well, the Sri Lankan government's not too happy about it.
I bet. I mean, no country really likes another country telling it what to do, especially not when it comes to internal stuff, right?
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're going to unpack today. Why the UK felt the need to impose these sanctions now, who exactly these sanctions are hitting, and what this whole thing tells us about how the Sri Lankan government wants to deal with its past.
Dealing with the past, huh? Especially
Yeah.
when you've got a history like Sri Lanka's with that long civil war and everything.
Yeah, it's a lot to untangle. We're basically using this really in-depth article by Vikalpa as our guide. It covers both what the UK announced and how the Sri Lankan government responded.
Vikalpa, okay, so that's giving us both sides of the story.
Right. And it's important to hear both sides. But just to set the scene a little, I think it's interesting that these sorts of international actions tend to crop up when there's a feeling that things aren't being dealt with properly on a domestic level.
Yeah, it's like if a country's not taking care of its own problems, other countries start to feel like, hey, maybe we need to step in.
Right, like it becomes an international concern. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what the UK actually did.
Okay, let's hear it.
So it was March 24th, 2025. The UK's Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, he's the one who made the announcement.
Big announcement, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. And he basically said that the UK is super committed to human rights in Sri Lanka and that they want to see those who committed violations be held accountable. He even emphasized how the effects of those violations are still felt today.
Makes sense. I mean, if they're imposing sanctions, they got to have a strong reason, right?
Absolutely. But these sanctions are more than just words. We're talking travel bans to the UK and asset freezes for these 4 individuals.
Travel bans and asset freezes. Yeah. Wow, that's pretty serious stuff.
It is. It's them saying, you're not welcome here, and we're going to make it difficult for you to operate financially. So let's get to who these 4 people are. First up, we've got General Shavendra Silva.
Silva. Okay. What did he do?
Well, he was the army commander and also commanded the 58th Brigade during the final stages of the Civil War, when things were really intense.
Oh, yeah, that was a brutal period.
Absolutely. And the accusations against him are heavy. We're talking involvement in enforced disappearances and the killing of Tamil civilians.
Enforced disappearances and killings. Those are some of the most serious violations you can have during a conflict.
Exactly. And get this, the U.S. had already sanctioned him earlier.
No kidding. So both the UK and the US are targeting this guy. What does that tell you?
It definitely shows how seriously they're taking these allegations. Like, it's not just one country's opinion.
It's a pretty strong message when you've got two major players like that on the same page.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so the second person is Rear Admiral Vasantha Karanagoda. He was a Navy commander.
Navy commander, okay. What's the story with him?
He's accused of being involved in the abduction, torture, and murder of 11 young people. And it gets even more complicated because the Sri Lankan government dropped the charges against him back in 2021.
Wait, they dropped the charges, so what happened then?
Then they appointed him governor of the Northwestern Province.
Wow. So he goes from being accused of some horrific stuff to getting a top government position.
It's definitely a head-scratcher. Oh, and the U.S. had also sanctioned him previously, just like Silva.
So this guy, with serious allegations against him, is not only walking free, but he's actually been promoted in a sense.
You could say that. Okay, moving on. Number 3 on the list is General Jagath Jayasuriya, another former army commander.
Okay, another general. What's this one about?
The accusations against him are tied to his time commanding the Joseph Camp. Torture, sexual violence, enforced disappearances, the whole 9 yards.
Joseph Camp. That name rings a bell. It's been mentioned in other reports about potential war crimes.
It has. And, when you hear those kinds of accusations repeatedly tied to a specific place, it makes you wonder if we're talking about something systematic.
Right, like it's not just a few bad apples, it's a pattern of abuse.
Exactly. Okay, last but not least, we have Vinyagamurthy Muralitharan, but he's more commonly known as Karuna Aman.
Karuna Aman. Now, that's a name I've heard before. Wasn't he with the LTTE?
He was. He was a commander for them, but then he switched sides and formed a pro-government paramilitary group back in 2004.
So he fought on both sides of the conflict. That's wild.
Yeah, his story is pretty complex. He's accused of recruiting child soldiers and carrying out assassinations. And guess what? After the war, he became a government minister.
You're kidding. A former LTTE commander turned government minister. That's quite the turnaround.
It is. So you see, with Karuna Aman, it's not just about holding one side of the conflict accountable.
Right. Accountability should apply to everyone, regardless of which side they were on.
Exactly. Now let's switch gears a bit and look at how the Sri Lankan government reacted to all this.
I'm sure they weren't thrilled.
Oh, not at all. 2 days after the UK announcement, the foreign minister, Wijith Herath, he issued a statement on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And they were pretty firm.
Okay. How so?
They basically condemned the UK's actions, calling them unilateral. Like the UK is acting on its own.
Yeah, going rogue. So what was their argument?
Their argument was that these sanctions actually hurt Sri Lanka's own reconciliation efforts and could potentially make things worse.
I mean, that's a pretty standard response when a country gets called out on the international stage.
It is. They're essentially saying, hey, we're dealing with this internally. You don't need to get involved.
Like, butt out. We got this.
Pretty much. They kept stressing how accountability should be dealt with through domestic mechanisms, their own courts and investigations. They claim they're actively working on making these mechanisms stronger.
But is there any evidence to back that up?
Well, that's where it gets tricky. The Vikalpa article, it's pretty skeptical about these claims. It points out that Sri Lanka doesn't exactly have a great track record when it comes to these internal accountability efforts.
Because it's saying it's all talk.
Kind of. They specifically mention the Office on Missing Persons, which was set up by the previous government.
Office on Missing Persons. And what happened with that?
Apparently it was well-intentioned, but it didn't really achieve much in the end.
So what's stopping Sri Lanka from effectively dealing with this internally? Like, why is it so hard?
It's a complicated situation. You've got potential political interference, maybe not enough resources dedicated to these complex investigations, and the legal framework itself might not be entirely up to par with international standards.
So there are a bunch of internal roadblocks making it tough to get real justice.
That's right. And this is where international efforts come into play.
Okay, so what role does the international community play here?
Well, the UK has been pretty active on this front. They're part of a core group of countries at the UN Human Rights Council pushing for accountability in Sri Lanka.
The UN Human Rights Council, okay. And what are they trying to do exactly?
Their main goal is to gather evidence and to make sure this whole issue of justice doesn't get swept under the rug. They want to keep the pressure on.
I see. So they're like the watchdogs, making sure things are moving forward.
Exactly. And the Vikalpa article is pretty adamant that these international efforts are crucial, especially when it seems like Sri Lanka is dragging its feet on the domestic front.
And they're not just talking about evidence gathering, right?
No, they're actually suggesting things like targeted sanctions, like what the UK just did, and even using the UN-collected evidence to prosecute those accused of war crimes.
Whoa. So they're pushing for some pretty concrete actions. That's a big step.
It is. They even frame it in terms of what makes a civilized state, basically saying that countries who shy away from truth and justice are more afraid than the criminals themselves.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
It is. And all this talk of war crimes might leave some people wondering what exactly that means.
Yeah, not everyone's a legal expert, right?
Right. So the article breaks it down pretty simply. War crimes are serious violations of international humanitarian law that happen during war or armed conflict.
Okay, that makes sense.
I'd like to make
some examples.
Sure. Deliberately killing civilians, torture, sexual offenses, recruiting child soldiers. Remember the accusations against Karuna Aman?
Oh, yeah, that fits right in.
Right. And then you've got things like enforced disappearances and killing or mistreating prisoners of war. It's a long list of horrific acts.
It's basically saying there are lines you can't cross, even in war.
Exactly. These aren't just unfortunate side effects of conflict. They're crimes. And those crimes have specific laws against them, like the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute.
The Geneva Conventions, those are like the rule book for war, right?
You got it. They set the standards for how people should be treated during conflict. And in the case of Sri Lanka, the allegations cover many of these categories. We're talking killing Tamil civilians, killing prisoners of war, sexual offenses, torture, the whole spectrum.
It's a horrifying picture.
Yeah.
And these accusations have been swirling around for years.
They have. It's why there's this constant push for accountability. So let's talk about why it's so important to bring the people who committed these acts to justice.
I mean, justice for the victims has got to be a big part of it.
Absolutely. It's about acknowledging the harm they suffered and giving them some sense of closure, but it's also about deterring future atrocities, because if nothing happens to those who commit these crimes, it sends a message.
Like, hey, you can get away with it.
Exactly. It creates this culture of impunity where people think they're above the law,
Yeah.
and that can lead to more violence down the line.
Yeah. It becomes a vicious cycle.
And Sri Lanka, unfortunately, is a perfect example of this. Remember how some of those accused of serious crimes have actually been promoted to high positions?
Like Karanagoda.
Oh,
That's crazy.
it is. And the article argues that this kind of thing really hurts the government's credibility. People lose trust, and it becomes harder to move forward.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
If you see those who committed atrocities being rewarded, you're not going to have much faith in the system.
Right. And they even compare it to what could have happened in Rwanda after the genocide if people hadn't been held accountable.
Oh, wow. That's a powerful comparison.
It shows how dangerous this culture of impunity can be. But it's not all doom and gloom. The article also talks about the positive things that can come from holding perpetrators accountable.
Okay, so what are some of the good things that can happen?
Well, for starters, it can bring a sense of relief to the victims. It validates their suffering and allows them to start healing. It can also promote reconciliation, which is huge in a diverse country like Sri Lanka.
Yeah, with different ethnic groups and religions, reconciliation is essential for peace.
Definitely. And it strengthens the rule of law because it shows that everyone, regardless of their position, is subject to the law.
It sets a good precedent.
And in the long run, it contributes to peace and stability. It's not just about punishing individuals, it's about building a better future.
And it sends a message to the international community that Sri Lanka takes these issues seriously.
Exactly. It's all about taking responsibility. And that brings us to the Sri Lankan government's role in all of this.
So what's their responsibility here?
The article is pretty clear. They have a duty to uncover the truth about what happened during the war. They need to provide justice to the victims and really work towards reconciliation.
Sounds like a tough job, especially after so much time has passed.
It is. And it requires real action, not just words. They need to conduct independent investigations, prosecute those who are accused, and make sure the truth is out there.
So they can't just pay lip service to it. They have to actually do something.
Right. But here's the thing. Despite all the promises to strengthen their domestic mechanisms, the courts and investigations, they haven't really delivered.
So there's a gap between what they say they're going to do and what they actually do.
Yeah, and that's a problem. Because if they don't step up, they're going to lose even more trust from the international community. And it's going to be that much harder to achieve peace in Sri Lanka.
It's a lose-lose situation. They damage their reputation and hurt their own country in the process.
Exactly. And remember how the government dismissed the UK sanctions as unilateral? Well, the article isn't buying it. They say that kind of response is unprofessional and just makes things worse.
So they're basically shooting the messenger.
Yeah, instead of addressing the concerns head on. And this kind of behavior, dismissing legitimate criticism, it just allows the culture of impunity to continue.
Which ultimately hurts everyone in Sri Lanka.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the long-term impacts of the war. Even though it ended 16 years ago, people are still suffering, especially in the north and east.
So the wounds are still very much open.
They are. People are still searching for missing relatives, there are issues with land acquisition by the government, and the military presence remains strong.
So it's not just about the past, it's about the present too.
Right. The war's legacy continues to cast a shadow. And the article points out that the current government, what they call the Malema government, hasn't really come up with any good solutions to these problems.
So there's still a lot of work to be done.
A lot of work. And at the end of the day, it's up to Sri Lanka to address these issues. So to sum it all up, these UK sanctions really highlight the international community's frustration with the lack of accountability in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, they're basically saying, we're watching and we're not happy with what we're seeing.
And the Sri Lankan government, they're pushing back, saying they can handle it themselves, but their actions haven't really matched their words.
It's a complicated situation with no easy answers.
Yeah.
But understanding these different perspectives, the history, the legal definitions, it's all important.
It is. And for you listening, it helps you grasp the challenges of post-conflict justice and reconciliation, not just in Sri Lanka, but around the world.
Because unfortunately, these issues are all too common.
They are. And on that note, here's something to think about. We've talked about different views on how to achieve accountability. But what do you believe the international community's role should be? Should they intervene? And if so, how can they do it in a way that actually helps a country like Sri Lanka achieve genuine reconciliation?
It's a tough question, but it's one worth pondering. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.